Hey, it's Matt with Full-Race Motorsports, back again with another Turbo Kit install. Are you looking to make 700 horsepower reliably on your Gen 3 Raptor or F-150? Well, I've got the kit for you. This is the Full-Race Formline Turbo Kit. We're gonna show you what's included, how to install it, and we're gonna make some power. First, let's start with what's included. We'll start over here with their K&N inlet tubes, wastegate harnesses, Garrett PowerMax turbochargers that do come with the OEM adapters. We're making big power, you don't need this. Inconel hardware for your manifold, the Full-Race upgraded coolant line kit, all hardware and oil lines necessary for installation, the Full-Race by SPD downpipe. Importantly, we include lubricant and anti-seize for all of your O-rings and your hot parts. Got a toolbox magnet, that's very important, and my favorite piece, the Formline turbo manifold. To get started, of course, we're gonna rack the truck. Corey's gonna pull the wheels off, and we're gonna get to work. For safety reasons, before we do anything, we're going to remove the negative terminal of the battery. This will be a 10 millimeter. We'll start by racking the truck, lifting it in the air, taking the front wheels off. Next, you'll take the fender flares off. There will be 5 7 millimeter screws holding the flares on. Behind the flare, there will be a clip that will need to be released that connects the side blinker light. Now to get the fender liner out, you will have 5 plastic clips and 7 7 millimeter screws. The 5 plastic clips are inside the wheel well. 7 millimeter screws, you have 5 on the outside and 2 inside. Fender liner does tend to come out a little easier if you start at the rear and work your way forward. We'll now move on to the driver's side of the vehicle and repeat the process. The driver's side is a little bit more complicated because of the electrical components that are attached to the underside of the fender liner, but it's pretty much the same process. Again, just like the liner, the fender flares do tend to pop off easier if you start from the rear and work your way forward. Before we take the driver's side fender liner out, we're gonna lower the truck down so we can get a picture of the electronics above the fender liner. This is gonna help us put everything back in place when we're done. To make removing the driver's side fender liner a little easier, it is nice to start the plastic clips that hold the electronics on by tapping them with a mallet. The 3 plastic clips that are in a triangle pattern holding the heat shield onto the back side of the fender liner do not need to be removed. To give yourself a little more room on the driver's side, we'll remove the plastic bracket holding the wire harness on. It's an 8 millimeter bolt and a plastic clip. Now that we have the fender liners out and we have access to the turbochargers, now is a good time to spray all of your hardware with some PB Blaster. Let that start soaking while we do the rest of the process. It'll make removing the hardware a lot easier. Next, we're going to drain the coolant. Start by removing the radiator cap. Make sure the engine is completely cooled down before you remove the radiator cap. Then we'll locate the radiator's petcock located on the driver's side of the vehicle. We like to use a 3/8 inch rubber hose connected to the petcock, kind of direct the coolant into a bucket rather than letting it spill all over the floor. Next, using a flathead screwdriver, we will remove the clamps holding the intake tubes and the hot pipes to both the driver and the passenger side turbo. While we're in there, we'll also use a pick tool to release the wastegate plug.
There's a lock, and then you squeeze and pinch here.
Due to the location of the clamp in relation to the shock tower on the driver's side, it makes it a lot easier to use a short, stubby, flathead screwdriver for that clamp. With the inlet pipes loosened from the turbos, remove them completely from the turbo. We will be replacing those with the K&Ns later. On the hot pipe side, we need to remove the couplers that are attaching the hot pipes to the turbos. We'll be replacing those with the Full-Race version. We'll now move on to the underside of the truck. We're going to remove the transmission skid plate to gain access to the downpipes. The skid plate's held on by 2 10 millimeter bolts and 4 13 millimeter bolts. They all need to be removed completely. The 13 millimeter bolts are located on the sides of the skid plate, and the 10 millimeter bolts are underside towards the front. In order to gain access to the passenger side oil drain, we need to move the starter forward. We do not need to remove the starter completely from the vehicle. We do not need to remove any of the starter's electrical from the vehicle. We're just simply moving it forward. This will take two 13mm bolts, loosen that starter up, and you may have to get a pry bar in there to just shift that starter forward and give you access to the oil drain. Next, we're going to loosen the downpipe from the hot side of both turbos. Both sides have 15mm nuts holding the downpipe in place. Remove those nuts and loosen the downpipe from the turbo. We'll then move downstream on the downpipe and loosen the two 13mm bolts holding the ball flange together, and then the two 15mm nuts holding the clamp on. Next, we'll move on to removing the downpipe from the vehicle. To remove the downpipe out of the vehicle, we need to first get the crossmember out of the way. There is a heat shield attached to the crossmember that contains four 13mm bolts. Remove those bolts, the heat shield will come right off. You'll then remove the crossmember from the transmission mount. This is held on by two 21mm bolts. Then we will unbolt the smaller heat shields above the crossmember. There's one on each side. Each of them have a 10mm bolt holding them in place. On the top of the crossmember, you will also find a heat shield that is held on by adhesive. This may just be peeled off and restuck when we're done. Then to swing the crossmember out of the way, we'll loosen the four 15mm nuts and four 18mm bolts holding the crossmember. Furthest to the driver's side can just be loosened so you can swing the crossmember down and out of the way towards the driver's side of the vehicle. Then, using a 15mm socket, we will release the clamshell clamp that is holding the downpipe hanger. We'll unclip all four O2 sensor wiring harnesses. The O2 sensors will be removed from the downpipe once it's out of the vehicle. Wire sensor harness clips are located on the sides of the transmission. After that's done, the downpipe can then be removed from the vehicle. We will now move on to removing the passenger side turbo. We're going to be removing lines, and in order to get to the lines, we have to get the wastegate actuator out of the way. We'll start by removing the three 10mm bolts holding the wastegate actuator in place, and then rotate it backwards towards the rear of the vehicle to make some more space for yourself. Next, we'll remove the oil feed line from the block. We'll use a 3-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then the water line in the block, using a 6-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the oil feed line in the turbo using a T45 Torx, and now the oil feed line can be removed completely. You'll need to use a pry bar to pop the feed line out of the turbo. Next, we're going to remove the T45 Torx from the oil drain line in the block, and then we will remove the three 12mm bolts holding the turbo to the manifold. Now, we're going to wiggle the turbo to release all of the coolant. We're releasing the coolant before removing the oil lines to ensure that we do not get coolant in the oil. Once coolant stops draining, we're then going to remove the coolant line from the block and let the coolant drain out again. Now we've removed all of the coolant from the system, and you should have very little left in the turbo. We have now removed the oil feed line completely from the vehicle. The oil drain line is still in the turbo, but not attached to the block. Both coolant lines are still in the turbo, but not attached to the motor. Now we will wiggle the turbo out of the vehicle with the lines still attached. Now that we have the passenger side turbo completely out of the vehicle, it's time to move on to the manifold. On the passenger side, we have an EGR line that connects to the manifold. We have to remove that EGR fitting from the manifold in order to get the manifold out. Using two large crescent wrenches, we will remove the nut from the fitting that is in the manifold. While doing this, make sure the fitting in the manifold does not twist. You'll use one crescent wrench to hold the fitting that's in the manifold in place, while using the other crescent wrench to turn the nut off of the fitting. You don't want the fitting that's in the manifold to twist. If it does, it can twist the EGR tube and damage it. Now it's time to move on to removing your factory manifold. There are 8 13mm nuts holding the manifold to the head. Some years do have a heat shield in the way. It is okay to bend that heat shield a little bit out of the way to get to the 13mm nuts. With the nuts out, you can now remove the manifold, and then you'll need to remove any remaining studs left in the head. Most will come out and self-extract themselves when you remove the nuts, but any of the manifold studs left will require a 3/16 socket to remove. Before moving on to the driver's side, one of the most important pieces we're going to replace is the oil feed filter. The Gen 3s have a feed filter on the passenger side only. You'll remove that with a 13/16 socket. Replace that with the new one that comes in the install kit. We just got the oil filter out of the passenger side of the block. It's very, very important you replace this oil filter. This filter is filtering all of the oil going into your passenger side turbo. The filter can get clogged up, and then when it gets clogged up, it doesn't allow enough oil to reach your turbo, then starving your turbo of oil, and it's not lubricated well enough, and that's how you end up smoking your turbos. Very important you replace this every time you're replacing a turbo. Replacing a turbo, put a new oil filter in. We'll now move on to the driver's side. We'll start by removing the turbo. First, to give us some more space, we're going to separate the steering shaft. This takes a 13 millimeter. The steering shaft is a square peg going into a square hole, so it is smart to mark this, but you don't have to be too careful. As long as your steering wheel doesn't rotate more than 90 degrees, you will be able to put this back in place without issue. After the steering shaft is out of the way, we're going to remove the oil feed line from the block. Again, using a 3-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the water line from the block. Again, same as the passenger side, 6-inch extension with a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the oil feed line from the turbo. Again, just like the passenger side, T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the 3 12-millimeter bolts holding the turbo to the manifold. And again, we'll wiggle the turbo free to release the coolant. Next, we'll pull the turbo out of the vehicle. It is a little bit more difficult. You have less space on the driver's side than you do the passenger side. You don't need to worry about damaging any of the lines. The install kit comes with all the lines. We're replacing all those later on. Next, we'll remove the manifold. Again, same as the passenger side, it's 8 13-millimeter nuts. Pull the manifold and the manifold gasket out, and then remove the remaining studs that stayed in the head with a 3/16. Now that we have your factory turbos and manifold out of the truck, we'll begin to assemble the new PowerMax turbos. A little bit of assembly is required on the bench. Start with a nice clean bench. You don't want any dirt or debris inside your turbos. You will need to remove the coolant lines from your factory turbos. We will be reusing the T45 Torx bolts that hold your coolant lines onto your factory turbos. Other than that, everything else is included. We have a driver and we have a passenger side turbo. We have driver and passenger oil feed lines. You know the passenger side because it's the longer of the two feed lines. We don't need these right now. We're gonna snake these between the turbo and the motor mounts later inside the vehicle, so we'll set these aside. Next, you have driver and passenger oil return lines. You know the passenger side because it has a long straight on one end. Driver side does not have that long straight. We will attach these to the turbo to help hold the turbo in place when we put it back in the truck. Coolant lines. On the driver side, the longer of the two lines that is incomplete goes on the driver's side. The complete line goes on the passenger side. The shorter lines, shortest of the shorter line goes on your driver's side. Longer of the shorter lines goes on the passenger side. It does come with AN fittings. Those are going to go on the head and the block on both sides. So just like the feed lines, we'll set those aside for now. These are your turbo to manifold gaskets. Those will be tapped into place. And last, in your coolant line, you have this one fitting. This will go on the motor later. Set it aside for now. Let's put some turbos together. I'm going to start with the driver's side turbo so I don't get anything mixed up. Do them one at a time. Put the passenger side turbo aside. We're going to start by putting the turbo to manifold gasket in. This way, you don't have to try tapping this thing in while you have lines attached. Don't want to damage anything. You can force this in with your fingers. If you need, you can use a rubber mallet to tap it all the way in. Let's move on to our coolant lines. You'll notice the shoulder of your coolant lines. One is a little shorter than the other. We have a long shoulder and a short shoulder. The short shoulder will go on first. The longer will go on top. The top of your turbo is the side with the wastegate actuator on both the driver and the passenger. With your coolant lines, the longer of the two lines goes towards the top side. The shorter goes towards the bottom side on both driver and passenger. As I said, we are going to reuse your T45 Torx from your old turbo. And anytime we're installing anything with an O-ring, we are going to use some silicone lubricant. So we'll start with the bottom. Put some silicone lube on your O-ring. Get it all the way around. This will help it go in smoother and prevent it from ripping or tearing. Just give it a wiggle until it pops into place. Again, silicone lubricant. Get it all over your O-ring and pop that into place. A little wiggle, you'll feel it pop in. Take the T45 Torx from our factory turbo. Get that in there. Drive it in gently and we'll torque it down. We're going to put our oil return line in. This is going to really help us when we're installing our turbo. We're going to use this to kind of hold our turbo in place when we put it up in the motor. Garrett supplies hardware for this. It is a T30 Torx. We'll remove that. And then we'll install our return line. With your oil return line, the longer side is going to go in the block. The shorter side is going to go in the turbo. Some silicone lube on our O-ring. And just like the coolant lines, we'll press this in until that O-ring pops in place. Reinstall the supplied hardware. I'm going to gently drive this in and then torque it down. While we have it in front of our face and we're thinking about it, let's lubricate the other side of the drain line so that goes in nice and easy into the motor. Your driver's side is assembled and ready to go in the truck. Set this aside, let's work on our passenger side. All right, let's bring our passenger turbo back in. Again, we will start with our gasket, turbo to manifold gasket. Press that in. Again, rubber mallet will seat that all the way in. Coolant lines. We're reusing again the T45 Torx from our factory turbo. We have our two coolant lines here. Long side, just like on the driver's side, is going to go to the top of the turbo, which is the wastegate actuator side. Short side is going to go to the bottom of the turbo. Same as on the driver. We have a short shoulder and a long shoulder. Short shoulder goes underneath, long shoulder goes on top. I'm going to start with the short shoulder. Always lubricate the O-rings. Put the short in, press it into place. Now we'll go to the long side. Lubricate the O-ring. Got a T45 Torx off our factory. Get that started. Drive it in gently. And then we'll torque it down. Move on to the drain line. The long end of your drain line goes into the block. Short end goes into the turbo. We have supplied hardware here. T30 Torx again. Remove that. We will lube our O-ring. And seat that into place. Put our supplied hardware back in. I'll drive it in gently. And we'll torque it down. So that we don't forget to do it, let's lube the O-ring now. We've got two fully assembled turbos now, ready to go in the truck. Headed back to the fender wells, we will start on the passenger side of the vehicle. We'll then put the AN fittings that were included in your coolant line kit, one in the block and one in the back of the head. The block, you're going to reuse your T45 Torx. Back of the head, you're going to reuse your 13mm bolt. We'll install all 8 Inconel studs into the block using an inverted T7 Torx. And then we will install the manifold and install all of the 13mm nuts using the proper torque sequence outlined in the install guide. We'll then tighten the EGR nut to the manifold. When doing this, make sure you hold the EGR tube to the fitting on the manifold while you tighten the nut down. If you use the nut to bring the tube to the manifold, you have a chance of damaging that tube. We'll then bring the turbo up into the fender well. Then using the drain line to hold the weight of the turbo, we will insert the drain line first. We will then hand tighten the coolant lines to the already installed AN fittings, and then snake the feed line between the turbo compressor and the motor mount and tighten. We're using your T45 Torx on both the motor and the turbo. Now we will tighten the turbo to the manifold using the T50 Torx bolts. Finally, fully tighten the coolant lines to your AN fittings using both an 11/16 wrench and 11/16 crow's foot. Moving over to the driver's side, we'll start by putting the AN fittings in the block and the back of the head, just like you did the passenger side. The only difference here on the driver's side, you will need to tighten the AN push lock fitting to the back of the head. Again, the block is a T45 Torx. On this side, the back of the head is an 8mm. Then we will install all 8 Inconel studs into the block using an inverted T7 Torx. If you do have a cold weather package, the block heater is a little in the way here. Start by installing the top studs first, place the gasket, and then the bottom studs. We'll then install the manifold using the 13mm supplied nuts in the proper torque sequence outlined in the install guide. Just like we did on the passenger side, we're going to lift the turbo up into the fender well and use the drain line to support the weight of the turbo. Insert the drain line into the block. We will then hand tighten the coolant lines to the AN fittings. On the back of the head, you will need to push the coolant line onto the barb fitting. A little lubricant helps here. We will then snake the oil feed line between the turbo compressor and motor mount and tighten both the motor and the turbo side using T45 Torx. There are different bolts that you removed. Originally, the shorter goes in the turbo, the longer goes into the motor. We will then secure the turbo to the manifold using the T50 Torx bolts. We'll then fully tighten the coolant lines to the AN fittings using the 11/16 wrench and an 11/16 crowfoot. Now that the manifold and the turbo is installed, we'll move on to reinstalling the hot pipe as well as the Cannon inlet pipe on both the driver and the passenger side of the vehicle. You can discard the couplers that came with your Cannon inlet pipes because you'll instead use the Full-Race supplied couplers. We'll put the Full-Race supplied couplers on the turbo side of the pipe, and then we'll lower the pipes down into the engine bay, ultimately connecting it with the inlet of the turbo. Tighten the clamps using a flathead screwdriver. On the hot pipes, you will discard the factory coupler and instead use the Full-Race supplied couplers. Again, connecting the hot pipe to the turbo outlet, tightening the clamps with a flathead screwdriver. Once the inlets and the hot pipes on both sides are in place, we will then use the supplied wastegate adapter harness to connect the wastegate to the factory harness. Do this on both passenger and driver side. With the inlet pipes in, we'll now move back up top. We'll plug all of the quick disconnect fittings back into your inlet pipe and then reassemble your inlet pipes to your intake. We'll then replace the starter by pushing it back into place and retightening the bolts using a 13mm socket. Now we'll move on to putting the downpipe in the truck. We'll start by swapping your O2 sensors from your factory downpipe to your new SPD downpipes. Then we'll put downpipe to turbo gaskets on your downpipes. Do this by inserting the bolts through the downpipe into the gasket. The gaskets have tabs that will assist in holding everything together. Before inserting the bolts into the turbine housings, make sure you add anti-seize to them. Insert the passenger side downpipe into the turbo and tighten the downpipe bolts using an 8mm Allen socket. Then we'll move on to the driver's side. Connect the driver's side downpipe to the outlet of the turbo using the 8mm Allen bolts as well. We'll now connect the back half of the driver's side downpipe to the front half using the V-band clamp. The nut on this is a 13mm. Then connect the driver's side downpipe to the rest of your exhaust using the 2-bolt flange, which is held together by 2 13mm bolts and 2 15mm nuts. The passenger side downpipe to the exhaust is held together using a sleeve clamp that is tightened with 2 15mm nuts. We'll then plug the O2 sensors back in. If you remember, these plugs are located on the sides of the transmission. We'll then reattach the cross member, reattach the previously removed heat shields, and the transmission mount. We're now going to move up top and fill the system with coolant. Attach your negative terminal to your battery to provide power. And then we're going to move on to probably the most important part of the whole process, which is priming the turbos with oil. If you do not prime your turbos with oil and you start the truck, the turbo starts spinning without any lubricant inside of them, you will damage the turbos. This is very important. To do this, we're going to put our foot on the brake as well as on the gas, making sure the gas stays all the way to the floor the entire time. This will prevent the motor from actually starting. We'll then turn the motor over as many times as it takes to build oil pressure in the system. Your oil gauge is at the top of your dash. Watch that. Once you build oil pressure, you're good. The turbos are primed. So I'll put my foot on the brake, foot on the gas, all the way to the floor. Hold it there, do not lift. Turn the motor over. No oil pressure yet, we'll do it again. You can see the oil pressure climb. That's showing that you now have pressure in your system. And the hard part's done. Now that you have the turbos primed, start the truck, check for leaks, reinstall the skid plate, reinstall the fender liners, reinstall the fender flares, put the wheels and tires back on, and drop it back on the ground. If you bought the MPT tune from us, load it on the truck. If you didn't, get with your favorite tuner, do some data logging, get a good tune on the truck. We saw 700 horsepower with ours. I know you can see it with yours. If you have any questions at all, leave them in the comments. We'll get back to you.